Good afternoon, Trinidad and Tobago, and welcome to another episode of Take a Stand for Trinidad and Tobago. Let me start by first wishing the Hindu community a happy Diwali. We are having this special episode to coincide with the major international conference on the climate, COP26. You may have heard that Trinidad and Tobago's Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley, spoke yesterday, November the 2nd, about this country's action plan and how it intends to deal with climate change. There has been some media coverage, but a lot of memes about his speech. And let's be honest, let's be frank, he really did not represent himself or our country well. Today I want us to look a little deeper at what is happening with climate change in Trinidad and Tobago and what the Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley, is saying, or rather, what did he say at COP26. To begin this analysis, I would like to ask you about two things. The first is climate change. What does it mean to you? Picture climate change in your mind for a bit. Think about flooding. What do landslips, landslides, or damage to houses and buildings mean to you? When we are in a heat wave, how does that impact you? Or the Sahara dust covering everything or making it hard just to breathe. Think about food prices when the place gets hotter, when there's no rain for things to grow, or when there are floods that wash away crops, or storms that make it hard for us to import food to Trinidad and Tobago. And of course, if you are living in a coastal community, what does your future look like? The second thing I want you to think about is the Prime Minister's speech itself yesterday and COP26. Is he speaking on your behalf? When he talked about climate change, did he talk about how it affects your living conditions? Did he talk about flooding and the cost of cleanup? Does he understand how you feel about climate change? Did he talk about what worries you or what you know or don't know about climate change? When Dr. Rowley gave these speeches and go to these meetings and talk about climate change, and he talks about Trinidad and Tobago, is he speaking for you? Now let me take a few moments to explain what COP26 is and why Dr. Rowley's speech was really a flop, but also a flop that we need to pay very close attention to. In 1992, countries joined an international treaty called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, because there was a recognition that we are entering a climate crisis. It is a framework for international cooperation to combat climate change by limiting average global temperature, the increases of those temperature, which is resulting in climate change, and coping with impacts that were by then inevitable. The Conference of Parties, which is what the COP stands for, it doesn't mean Congress of the People or Commission of Police. It means Conference of Parties. That is the supreme decision-making body of the Convention on Climate Change. All states that are parties to the Convention on Climate Change are represented at this conference that they call Conference of Parties, COP. The different countries review the implementation of the Convention and any other legal instruments that the Conference of Parties adopts and take decisions necessary to promote the effective implementation of the Convention, including institutional and administrative arrangements. This current Conference of Parties is called COP26 simply because it is the 26th of these conferences. As I mentioned, the Prime Minister spoke to the COP on November the 2nd, 2021. Regardless of the jokes and the memes, and you know, we in Trinidad, we love jokes and memes and we love to laugh and so on. But putting aside the jokes, we in Trinidad and Tobago need to pay close attention to what the Prime Minister said in Glasgow, because he went in front of people to make a commitment on behalf of the people of Trinidad and Tobago that most of us know nothing about. So let me just give you some highlights. He said any temperature increases beyond the 1.5 degrees Celsius level will have long-term and permanent consequences. particularly for small countries and economies such as Trinidad and Tobago. The only solution, therefore, is to increase collective ambition. What that means, we'll have to see what this collective ambition really means. Secondly, we also need to implement strategies to unlock capital flows. Unlock capital flows in support of energy transition and ensure reliability and affordability. Third, loss and damage are already clear in the aggressive erosion of our coastline and the bleaching of our coral reefs. 4, there must be an equitable balance, you hear that too, equitable balance between public finance for mitigation and adaptation. And 5, that as an economy largely based on oil and gas and petrochemicals, we in Trinidad and Tobago recognize our responsibility in transitioning over reasonable and manageable time to net zero. We have set very ambitious targets aimed at diversifying our economy. We have gone so far as to embark upon ambitious plans to reduce emissions and build climate resilience. So what is the Prime Minister really saying on behalf of Trinidad and Tobago? Is that we will be ambitious in a quote-unquote reasonable and manageable time frame, or that we really don't want to give up carbon, but we want the rest of the world to stop. According to him, coral bleaching is our biggest climate change problem. Most importantly, we need money from outside before we do anything. And what are the measures that Trinidad and Tobago will implement to reduce emissions and build resilience? This is the most important part of his speech for us here in Trinidad and Tobago. And here's what he came up with. 1, the largest utility-scale solar renewable energy project in the Caribbean with a capacity of 112 megawatts. A whole 10% of our power needs this energy. But what he didn't say, or rather, let me remind you of the budget speech, which made it very clear that it is BP going to be financing this thing. BP, don't forget that part. Then there's e-mobility policy. And then he talked about a just transition policy to address socioeconomic issues that aims at reskilling, retooling, and developing new capacity for a low carbon economy. 4, investment in green hydrogen to provide green feedstock to our vibrant petrochemical industry. And 5, explore the use of industry generated carbon dioxide in possible carbon sequestration projects. If this sounds new or even strange, trust me, Trinidad and Tobago, you're not alone. Almost none of this is part of the national discussion. Judging on past performance, either these promises will not happen at all, like the rapid rail, don't forget that, or they will come like a thief in the night. And that is based on track record. The solar plant that was mentioned in the budget, as I told you, that was never a budget that was never debated. Remember, that budget was never debated. And as I said earlier, that is financed by BP, multinational BP. And apparently this e-mobility refers to electric cars. So somehow, people in Trinidad and Tobago are moving away from gasoline and diesel towards electric cars. Maybe the Prime Minister should have said that what we will have will be a no-car policy, because who can afford electric cars? And he never stated whether the subsidy will be transferred from gas and diesel to electric cars. And what about this fancy term, carbon sequestration? Well, that refers to trapping the carbon from industry, as in making sure plants and factories like what we have in Point Lisas and the East-West Corridor don't put more carbon dioxide into the air. It can be very expensive and technical, and makes me wonder, has anyone told the Prime Minister about trees? We can just plant trees to capture carbon. Guyana, Belize, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent are some of the countries who understand that. And just yesterday, promised to be a part of the program to end and reverse deforestation. But we didn't hear that from our Prime Minister. The biggest problem to me, and maybe to you, is this so-called just transition policy that he referred to. It is more than just another example of the Prime Minister using words that don't really reflect reality. So what is the just transition? It's really a combination of two concepts. Firstly, transition, meaning change, and secondly, justice, which is being fair to everyone, not just those who can afford to fly to fancy conferences in Europe or to buy politicians. The transitions, for us, we mean it's about, when we talk about this just transition, are the big changes in how economies actually work. For example, in Europe and North America, the Industrial Revolution was a huge transition that meant large part of the labor force stopped working on farms and moved to cities and started working in factories in exploitative conditions. At the same time, in the islands of Trinidad and Tobago and the rest of the Caribbean, society transitioned from communal free society with a subsistence economy, fishing, hunting, farming to meet needs, to a colonial slave society with a plantation economy using enslaved labor to produce products for export, with the profits going abroad. Now, it is important to draw on our own historical experience. If you want to learn more, I recommend a presentation by a good friend and brother and comrade, Ian Daniel. He's head of labor studies at the Cipriani College of Labor and Cooperative Studies, where he reminded everyone that Trinidad and Tobago has had previous experiences of transitions. And he made it clear that these transitions have never been just. For now, I will just point out that the end of slavery was an economic transition. The emancipated people were given nothing. No land, no housing, no education. Nothing to compensate them for the lifetime spent under torture and oppression, laboring to create wealth for other people. The plantation owners, however, they were compensated for their loss of property, quote unquote. They were told it was now illegal, on top of immoral, to own other people. But hold this for your trouble of not owning people anymore. So they got compensation, not the emancipated persons. So the end of slavery was a transition, but it was an unfair transition. Another transition in our history in Trinidad and Tobago that Comrade Ian Daniel reminded us of was the transition from agriculture to oil. American companies came in to South Trinidad just over 100 years ago to drill for oil. The products were used by the British Navy to get their ships around the world to maintain the British Empire. The profits went to the Americans. The products went to the British. The labor to get the oil out of the ground came from West Indians. Think of APT James from Tobago, or Tubal Uriah Buzz Butler from Grenada, or Elmer Francois from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The transition to oil meant that there was an underinvestment in the other economic areas. That transition played out until the closure of Caroni in 2003 and is still affecting people today because some Caroni workers were never justly compensated after the closure. We are now in a post-industrial transition. The steel mill was closed in 2016. That threw 600 people out of work and affected the demand for electricity and natural gas. So if you want to know why TNTech and NGC are in financial problems, don't forget that piece of the puzzle. Petrotrin, the petroleum company of Trinidad and Tobago, was closed in 2018, ending local refining and ended up by privatizing crude oil production. Thousands lost their jobs and oil production has not recovered to what it was in 2018. In both cases, steel and oil, the workers came together and presented proposals to revive their respective industries. Despite international support, solid business cases, and climate mitigation proposals, the government has continually turned down both steel workers and oil workers. You see, these proposals, proposal would have been an idea of transition as change. When we see these big economic changes, ordinary people are usually and almost always left behind. The same people who labor to create value, to create profits, are eventually discarded as the capitalist machine moves on to the next big thing. Caroni workers who never got their land, petroleum workers who are still in court for their termination, steel workers who were denied the opportunity to bring back their own jobs. That what we need really is justice. Justice is the second part of the just transition concept. The people who came up with the idea of just transition are three main groups: trade unions, meaning the workers, indigenous groups, and community organizations. The idea is that transitions should not cost workers or community residents their health, the environment, jobs, or economic assets. Any losses should be compensated. And the practice of just transition means that the people who are most affected, the frontline workers and the fence line communities, should be in the leadership of crafting policy solutions. For instance, I'll give you an example. In Canada, the government created a task force which traveled to communities who would be significantly affected by the closure of their coal industry. The task force, which included trade unions, met with workers and their families, community members, business representatives, and other stakeholders to gather opinions on dealing with the transition. This included a guarantee of job security and other steps needed to be taken before embarking on the transition. Trade unions have been part of the climate change discussion since inception in the 1990s. Trade unions were the ones pushing the concept of just transition ahead of the Kyoto conference, which was the Conference of Parties 3, or COP3, COP3, back in 1997. In fact, it was trade unions that put it on the agenda of the Kyoto conference. In 2010, the ITUC, International Trade Union Congress, had a resolution on just transition. That's in 2010. It was the trade union movement that made sure that just transition became part of the preamble of the Paris Agreement in 2015. This means that when our Prime Minister, Dr. Rowley, says the country has a just transition policy that no trade union or community groups ever saw, it is a nonsensical position. It was trade unions that developed and positioned just transition as an important and integral part of the climate change discourse. And the Prime Minister went to COP26 to say that this is what the country is doing, that we, quote unquote, we developed a just transition policy, without saying that the government alone had input. Let me quote from the so-called just transition policy that he referred to. I quote, "As a net exporter of petroleum products, its low electricity rates and fuel subsidies mean that it has historically had few incentives to introduce and develop renewable energy and energy efficiency technologies. Economically heavy subsidization of fuel and electricity means an uncompetitive environment for renewable energy technologies and a barrier for renewable energy market penetration due to the widespread availability of cheap fossil fuels. From 2006 until 2020, government provided fuel subsidies have been provided at substantial fiscal cost, roughly 25 billion TT or 3.6 billion US cumulatively. The government has combated this weakness by removing all super and premium gasoline subsidies. Remember that? And I continue. In January 2021, subsidies on diesel were removed, leaving only subsidies on liquefied petroleum gas, LPG. While there is a perception that fossil fuel subsidies benefit more vulnerable populations, this is what the draft policy is saying. In reality, they tend to be contrary to the principles of a just transition, as they tend to support status quo inequality. Ultimately, these subsidies reinforce sectors that would have otherwise become non-competitive on their own and reinforce patterns of inequality." End of quote. But where is the data to back that up? There is no evidence at all. The document doesn't refer to any evidence. The Prime Minister didn't refer to any evidence that the subsidies reinforce inequality in Trinidad and Tobago. What we know from the reality, what we know as citizens, based on what we feel every single day, is that the previous reductions in the gas subsidy and the increase in fuel prices is that the removal of those subsidies actually in reality created much greater inequality. It created greater hardship for citizens. And we need to remember that the biggest subsidizer of fossil fuel is the United States. So how are our little subsidies affecting energy markets? I mean, where is the logic in that? I mean, make that make sense, Dr. Rowley. Here's another quote from the policy. It said, towards a market price, I want Trinidad and Tobago to pay very close attention. Because to me, this is one of the most damning parts of what they envision as a just transition. So here's what it says. Towards a market price for fuel and electricity principle, the nation will continue to advance in pricing fuels and electricity in line with their actual production costs and market prices. Fossil fuel subsidies tend to be contrary to the principles of a just transition and the development of a green economy, as they do not help the poor and vulnerable and tend to support status quo inequality. Therefore, Trinidad and Tobago, do not be surprised if the Prime Minister comes back to Trinidad and Tobago to sell us government's so-called just transition and removing the gas subsidy. I am, however, preempting any such announcement by warning Trinidad and Tobago of the government's hidden agenda to continue their reorganizing of the state to create a neoliberal state with a business-friendly environment as a means to attract private investment from outside Trinidad and Tobago and extract wealth from ordinary people. That is their transition. But such thinking really reflect neoliberal ideas of the IMF and World Bank for several decades, which have proven to be colossal failures, as has been seen elsewhere, whether it's South Africa or Mexico. The green arguments used to promote structural adjustment in Trinidad and Tobago that will be accompanied by a number of assertions about global energy and policy trends and the so-called inevitability of a transition to a low-carbon future. The Prime Minister and the government tell us in Trinidad and Tobago that we are too dependent on the public sector and particularly oil and gas. While he creates pressure for ordinary people, please note that what the Prime Minister went to COP26 to do was to beg for handouts from richer countries. Does he have a consistent principle or ideology? Because we must not ask for a higher standard of living because there is no money, but at the same time the Prime Minister says, I quote, we can assess whether our climate finance flows are headed in the right direction, end quote. In this regard, the U.S. announcement, no, I will continue the quote here. He continued, in this regard, the U.S. announcement that it would double its climate finance support is particularly inspiring. That's what our Prime Minister said in COP26. That's what our Prime Minister went to that international conference, that very important international conference, to talk about U.S. climate financing is inspirational. Maybe, Dr. Rowley, if you had not closed Petrotrin, there would be money available to fund our climate adaptation and mitigation. Maybe if you had allowed Petrotrin to repay its loan instead of refinancing by putting the refinery, port and other assets under lien, the country would have had the capacity to transition. Maybe if the country was not up to its ears in debt, Trinidad and Tobago could invest its own money in solar power generation and not leave it up to multinationals like BP. Now, in response to the so-called draft policy, the OWT, with the support of the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy and the Global Labour University, worked on developing a very comprehensive response document. Now, you don't have to take my word for it, you know. You probably feel, well, you know, it's just a trade unionist trying to scaremonger. But you can visit the Elmer Francois Institute's YouTube channel. Visit it and hear presentations by Dr. Idira Jaffa, Director of the Global Labour University, Dr. Sean Sweeney of the Trade Unions for Energy Democracy, and Professor Nora Ratzel, Professor Emerita at the University of Omea. These are videos that are on the Elmer Francois Institute YouTube channel. Check it out. They're called Trade Unions for Just Transition. Listen to those presentations. So you don't have to take my word for it. We'll put it in the group chat so that you can access it. Let me give you a concrete example that there is nothing just about Trinidad and Tobago's current transition from the draft policy itself. Here is what it stated. Even before the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, hear that, eh? Even before the COVID-19 pandemic of 2020, Trinidad and Tobago's petroleum sector had already suffered a slew of job losses. Between 2015 and 2019, over 20,000 people lost jobs across all sectors. So when the Prime Minister talks about reskilling and retooling, we have to ask where? In the past 6 years, and for these 20,000 people and families across sectors, where is the reskilling? Where was the retooling? Our GDP has fallen, so where is the capacity building? What in fact we are experiencing in Trinidad and Tobago right now is structural adjustment, a structural adjustment program. That is what it is. It is structural adjustment. And it is structural adjustment based on the government's ideology of neoliberalism. And the government is attempting to package this structural adjustment program as a just transition when in fact it aims to advance further privatization, commodification, and liberalization of our country. Trinidad and Tobago. Trade unions have shown that the transition can only be just when all stakeholders are seated at the table, building and creating the plans for not just a just transition, but a progressive just transition. To ensure decent work and protection for the vulnerable in society, there should be programs targeting those in need so that no one is left behind. With a lower standard of living, we don't want that. The progressive just transition has to be with the idea that we can raise the standard of living of ordinary people. Not what we are seeing now, which is the opposite. So many of our citizens are already being left behind. The transition has started, Trinidad and Tobago, and thousands of people, thousands of families are being left behind. We as a society must call for a proper debate on what the approach should be in Trinidad and Tobago to tackle the challenges involved in addressing the need for global decarbonization and addressing the social and economic needs of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. We must decide as a society, we must decide what kind of state we want for ourselves. What kind of republic do we want for ourselves, for our children, for future generations? We demand a progressive just transition. A progressive just transition to a republic of Trinidad and Tobago that is based on social justice. Thank you.